Hello and welcome to my Psychology 2 by me, Tom Watkins. First of all, I want to talk about arousal in sport. Now, arousal, or this is my definition of arousal, is the level of focus and intensity we have that causes us to want to do an activity. In other words, arousal gives us the motivation to do an activity, and if we have optimal arousal, we perform at our potential. Now, a reference definition I found of arousal says that arousal is a general physiological and psychological activation varying on a continuum from deep sleep to intense excitement, and that is from Gold and Crane, 1992. Now, there are many factors that could affect arousal, and these could be that the crowd, for example, if the crowd start cheering or chanting, this could will the player to play better, and thus their arousal will be increased. This is especially true for sports like football, where the crowds are massive and have a big impact on one's arousal. Another thing that could affect it would be concentration. Now, arousal will affect the concentration. For example, if arousal is low, then the player will be focused on many different things, like someone in the crowd maybe, perhaps someone's boots, etc. If you want a penalty kick in rugby, the player might be focused on someone in the crowd, and so they are likely to miss a penalty, and their performance will go down as a result. And if the arousal is high, then the opposite happens. They become extremely focused on relevant things in the game, e.g. tackling a player in American football or hitting the ball in baseball. These individuals can be said to have tunnel vision, meaning they are sensitive to one particular cue. In between these two concentration levels is optimal arousal, where the player has high concentration levels and sensitive to all relevant cues. Another thing that could affect players and athletes' arousal is the other opponents they are playing against. Now, other opponents could affect the arousal levels in an individual, because it could be someone they know and so they play better, or it could be someone they know is better than them and so their performance could drop. For example, in football, if a team like Stevenage played a team like Real Madrid and Stevenage players could see that Cristiano Ronaldo was coming on, their performance would drop because they know he is much better than them. Now, another thing that could affect arousal is skills performed. Now, arousal levels can change depending on the skills that need to be performed. For example, for a complex skill, arousal will need to be low in order to do the skill, because they require a lot of attention and focus. And if the skill isn't very complex, then arousal levels need to be high, because it doesn't require a lot of focus or concentration. Another thing that could affect arousal would be the event. Like, if the event will have an impact on the arousal levels of an individual, because if the event is higher, e.g. a World Cup in football, then football will want to play better, so the arousal levels will be higher. In contrast, if the event is a low profile, maybe an FA Cup third round against a lesser team, then they'll be less aroused because they wouldn't want to play that game, and so their performance would drop. Now, the last thing that could affect arousal would be the media. If a game has been hyped up by the media, then arousal levels will be higher because they want to feel the hype and create a good game, and so their performance will be improved. Now I want to move on and talk about the theories associated with arousal, starting with Hull's drive theory. Now, Hull's drive theory, or the drive reductive theory, became popular during the 1940s and 50s as a way to explain behavior, learning, and motivation. The theory was created by behaviorist Clark Hull. This graph demonstrates a positive correlation between performance and arousal, meaning that at low levels of arousal, performance is low, and when arousal is high, performance is also high, so performance increases in line with arousal. An example of this would be that at the start of a football game, arousal level is low, and then as the game progresses, they start to get more arousal, and their performance increases as a result. At high levels of arousal, dominant behavior is always carried out. It will differ between novices and elite athletes, because the elite athletes the dominant behavior in elite athletes will be good for performance because they have been trained to do so. An example of this would be in basketball. When a pro takes a free throw, then they will probably score. However, when a novice takes a free throw, they will likely miss and crash under the level of arousal. Now, I don't think this theory is very valid because it suggests that performance will increase exponentially as long as arousal keeps rising. It doesn't take into account things like choking, where performance will greatly reduce due to over-arousal. This theory would be slightly more valid for sports that don't require a lot of concentration, like weightlifting, where they would need a lot of arousal in order to lift the mountain weight. Moving on to the next next graph, next theory is the inverted U theory. Now this theory suggests that there is a level of optimal arousal where the performer will perform at their best, because performance levels will perform at their best. Performance levels are at the best, or optimal levels. When arousal is too high or too low, then performance will decrease. It also states that at low levels of arousal, performance is low because the athlete isn't mentally ready. As arousal levels increase, the performance will get better until a certain point where optimal arousal is achieved, the performance is at its very best, and then after that, if arousal continues to rise, then performance will go down because the player will get too hyped up and will make mistakes. The theory is more valid than Hole's because it takes into account of under-arousal, e.g. boredom, and over-arousal, e.g. excitement, to the point of losing concentration. Now, for an example of this would be when a hockey player is optimally aroused, they will play at their best. When they are at low arousal, their motivation will be very low, and they will not be fully concentrating on their game. On the other hand, if they were over-aroused, then they would be too motivated and have tunnel vision, so they would not be thinking about the consequences that might follow their actions, such as going hard for a silly tackle, or losing their temper with officials or other players because they have lost their concentration. Another thing with inverted U theory is that there's another part that explores that different skills require different amounts of arousal in order to perform them well. If the skill needs a lot of muscle groups, it will require a higher level of arousal. Sports like weightlifting will need will need higher arousal in order to perform the skill. Whereas athletes that are involved in sports that use like finer skills, such as snooker or darts, will need lower levels of arousal because they need higher levels of concentration and focus in order for the skill. As you can see from the diagram, even though some skills require higher or lower levels of arousal, an athlete can still be under or over aroused for their particular skill. A sporting example of this would be a sporting example of a sport that would be low arousal to perform well would be golf. If they have too much arousal, they will become too worked up and won't be able to concentrate on the game. However, sports like shot put require a lot of arousal because they need to be hyped up in order to perform well. And if they are too under-aroused, then they won't be able to go the maximum weight. Now this theory is more valid than Hole's drive because it says that performance will increase with arousal until a certain point where optimal arousal is reached, and then after that, if arousal continues to rise, performance will decrease as arousal continues to rise. Now next theory is the catastrophe theory. Now this theory says that performance increases in an inverted U fashion only when the individual has low levels of anxiety, and I will cover anxiety later. If the athlete experiences high levels of anxiety and the arousal continues to rise, then the performer will see an extreme dramatic decrease in performance. Sports psychologists noted that performance does not always gradually decrease as arousal increases, like the inverted U suggests it, but many top sports performers choke in big events. The catastrophe theory shows a much more dramatic decline in performance. The difference between the U theory and the catastrophe theory is the dramatic decrease in performance. An example of this would be in basketball. A top player like LeBron James taking a free throw in the final of the playoffs and missing a shot because he was too aroused and he choked, and so his performance dipped greatly. Another sporting example would be in tennis. Andy Murray at the final of Wimbledon, and he double faults on his serve, he has choked due to over-arousal and anxiety. This theory is valid for when the performer considers the game to be of high value, because what is a big game for an amateur won't be a big game for a professional. I think that for big games it is more valid than inverted U because the inverted U doesn't take into account anxiety. Now the next graph, the next theory is the individual zones of optimal function. The individual zones of optimal function theory states that at low levels of arousal, performance will be lower, and when arousal is at its optimal, then performance will be at its best. When arousal levels keep increasing, performance will decrease. The main difference between the inverted U theory and the individual zones of optimal functioning is that the individual zones of optimal functioning say that optimal arousal is different for different sports. Generally, sports that require more concentration will be closer to the left side of the graph, meaning that they will need less arousal because they need more concentration, and it gives them too much of a broad attention span. An example of this would be in darts. The optimal arousal where performance would be at its best would be quite low compared to weightlifting, where arousal levels will need to be considerably higher. Next slide shows a graph of novice versus elite performers. This graph shows a novice versus elite graph where it shows different levels of arousal they both have, and how elite athletes have a greater optimal arousal linked to their level of performance rather than non-athletes. As I said earlier, elite athletes have been trained to make their optimal arousal good, and non-elite athletes may not have this characteristic or mental state coached into them, so when they're at optimal arousal, they could go to pieces and not be able to cope. As a coach, they would need to know the performer and situational effect. A sporting example of this would be when an elite athlete has high arousal, for example, when taking a penalty in football on the World Cup. He'd be trained to score it and would have more chances to score a penalty. When a non-athlete was in this situation of taking a penalty, they would have more chance of missing it, and some phrase it they would choke and therefore more chance of missing the penalty. Now that is arousal covered, move on to stress. Right, there's two different types of stress, and they are eustress and distress. Firstly, I'll talk about eustress. Eustress is a good form of stress that can give you a feeling of fulfillment. This stress lets you achieve your goal with good stress, as you'll be more motivated. An example of this may be a goalkeeper who will want to keep maybe 10 clean sheets in a season, and he will feel eustress, and this will help him achieve that goal. Eustress can increase skill level and focus attention to specific aspects of a sport. Now, some athletes actively seek out stressful situations as they like the challenge of pushing themselves to the limit. The benefit is that it helps intrinsic motivation. Now, the next form of stress is distress. Distress is a bad form of stress, and it's what people usually mean when they're talking about stress in like a bad way, like in a negative manner. It is a form of anxiety, nervousness, or apprehension as a result of perceived inability to meet the demand for a performance. An example of this would be an Olympic diver getting stressed about them going to dive, and so when it comes down to it, they don't enter the water correctly or they make a mistake. As the graph shows, it says that performance increases with eustress, but as soon as the athlete starts getting distressed and feeling anxious and apprehensive, that's when performance will decrease. Next slide talks about the 4 stages of stress. The 4 stages of stress are at stage 1. At the stage 1 process, some form of demand is placed on the athlete in a particular situation. An example would be the last player takes a penalty shootout to win the game for their team. At stage 2, the athlete perceives this demand either positively or negatively, so they see this demand placed on them as either positive or negative. It is at this stage that we start to understand how the negative perception of demand can cause a negative mental state and a lack of self-confidence and lack of concentration. So if a player, talking about the football situation, penalty shootout, if a player is called upon to take the last penalty to win the game for their team, then if they see it as a bad thing, like they don't want to let the team down, then they'll most likely miss and the team will lose and their performance will slip. But if they see it as a good thing and like they want to make everyone proud of them and they just want to have the achievement, then they'll usually score. Now at stage 3, increases the arousal level of the performer, and during this stage the athlete will experience heightened arousal, higher levels of cognitive and somatic anxiety, which we will cover later, and changes in attention and concentration levels. And then stage 4 determines the outcome of performance, either increased performance or reduced performance, and this depends on how they perceive the stress placed on them. Now I'll talk about the causes of stress. There are a number of causes of stress. It can either come from internal sources or external sources. Internal sources come from inside the body, such as past memories and experiences, current injuries, past injuries, or our own feelings of self-worth. Also, post-traumatic stress is internal stress. One sporting example of stress would be Eduardo, a player played for Arsenal, horrifically broke his leg in the game and wasn't the same since. This may be because every time he went into tackle, he